This is Andrew Soren, host of Meaningful Work Matters, and today we're diving into an important conversation with Dr. Carrie Oelberger about the complexities and sometimes surprisingly dark sides of meaningful work. As an expert studying international aid workers, Carrie reveals how our devotion to purposeful work can both strengthen and strain our personal relationships, and how different people seek and find meaning in vastly different ways. Due to the depth of insights Carrie shares, we've decided that this is going to be a two-part episode. In part one, we explore what happens when work becomes so meaningful that it starts affecting our lives outside the office, for better or for worse. Join us for this practical discussion about the true nature of meaningful work. Welcome to the Meaningful Work Matters podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Soren, founder of Eudaimonic by Design. On this podcast, we'll dive into the world of meaningful work, explore its complexities, and examine its impact on people and the organizations they're a part of. Each episode features insightful conversations with cutting-edge experts who are successfully navigating the challenges of meaningful work. We hope to offer you ideas, frameworks, and tools to unlock potential and design work that's fulfilling, impactful, and supports everyone's well-being. Subscribe or follow us now, and let's make meaningful work matter. Carrie Oelberger, it is a delight to be able to have you on Meaningful Work Matters. I have been using your name in so many different ways to talk about some of the research that you have done and its impact on especially the dark sides of meaningful work, but really you are such an important scholar in the field of meaningful work, period, that it is a delight to be able to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much for coming today.
Oh, thank you so much, Andrew. It's a pleasure to be here.
Maybe we can start by just telling us a little bit about who you are, what you want people to know about yourself, as well as what makes your work meaningful.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah. So I am an associate professor of management at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I am also currently a McKnight Land Grant professor at the University of Minnesota. And yeah, what makes my work meaningful? I mean, I think we'll probably talk more about this, but work can generate a sense of meaningfulness through a path of self-actualization or through a path of self-transcendence. In my research, I argue that when you have both of those things, your work can be particularly meaningful. And I have always sought work that seeks self-transcendence, I think ever since I was a teenager, sort of contributing to a cause that I believe in. And I have been grateful when my work also enables the path of self-actualization, which it currently does. Yeah. So I think, currently as an academic, I access self-actualization because I get to pursue research questions that I find really juicy and important, that stimulate my curiosity and allow me to build new frameworks and findings. And my work also enables both autonomy and flexibility to pursue self-actualization outside the workplace as well. So that's like filling my self-actualization bucket. And in addition, I feel like my current work also facilitates access to self-transcendence, particularly through my teaching, which I just delightfully enjoy. I'm privileged to work with a diverse array of different master's and doctoral students through the School of Public Affairs where I work, who are really committed to making a positive difference in the world. And they just inspire me every day. And I also think, I enjoy the self-transcendence of my work through being able to find creative ways to have my research have an impact on practice through organizations. So, yeah, I feel quite grateful and very fortunate to be able to have such meaningful work.
I feel like many humanists would applaud that answer, but we should actually unpack, what do those words mean? What does self-transcendence mean?
I mean, I guess the way that I think about self-transcendence is anything that has an impact outside myself, right? Like, is there a way in which, I guess, ever since I was young, I was interested in trying to leave the world a slightly better place than I found it, even in small little micro ways. And so for me, that's what self-transcendence is about. It's about being able to do something that it directly benefits me through my enjoyment in doing it, but it also hopefully has a positive impact more broadly, is the way that I've thought about it.
And I guess that in some way connects to self-actualization, in that I would assume that self-actualization in that way is much more of a self-focused or a me-focused kind of version of that, where the transcendence becomes an outward focus. Is that kind of
That's the way I've understood it.
oversimplified. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the delight in this space also is that people define them in different ways. Like the field's still quite nascent. And so I think
Mm.
people are coming to it from different places and defining meaningful work in different ways and with different contributing factors. And so in no means is that like, do I think that's the universal definition? But it's what I've used in my research. And it also has felt pretty resonant for me in my own personal life in terms of, yeah, ensuring that at least one of those axes is fulfilled. And for me, I guess the one that has felt more important has been self-transcendence. But yeah, I'm delighted to be able to engage in stuff that just I is juicy and it makes me curious. And that for me is a big piece of self-actualization.
Well, talking about juicy things that make us curious, I want to dive into some of the recent work that I've read of yours. It's all about values alignment. And I guess I will underscore this conversation to say that my giant takeaway from this research is that one size fits none, which is, I guess, a label that I'm increasingly finding the more that I dig into this theme of meaningful work and all of the complexities of what it makes, what
Mm.
it is, the more that I begin to realize that really one size does fit none when it comes to what makes work meaningful for us. So help us understand, some of the ways in which there's things that we value, which maybe you've described a little bit as work preferences, and then there's the ways that our jobs are actually designed. Can you help us just try to unpack some of those different things? What are the kinds of different values that you've been uncovering? And let's maybe just even start there.
Okay, sure. Yes, I mean I love that you picked that phrase that one size fits none. That's yeah, what my paper was sort of riffing off of. I think that sometimes, particularly, I think in nonprofit, social benefit, social enterprise, government work, which is generally the sphere that I focus on, there can be a sense that like everyone in this sector is motivated by these values, which I think could be quite dangerous, actually. And so I sort of brought some methods that have been traditionally used fairly broadly in the sort of for-profit management HR space into that space kind of for the first time. And so it was tricky getting it through the review process. But basically what it does is it looks at like what are someone's preferences and then to what extent are those preferences fulfilled by their current job. And so it's really a lot more looking at the sort of matching idea. And there's some nuances methodologically where you can look at sort of if you have an oversupply or an undersupply, that there's different nuanced effects. And so that's really what I was interested in pursuing, right? And I clustered people's preferences into like sort of intrinsic factors, right? Like, do you feel like your work is interesting? Do you feel like you're learning new things? Extrinsic factors, which are more like the reward system, like, what kinds of benefits do you have? What kind of salary are you receiving? And then relational factors. So, like, what are your preferences in terms of working with other people? And then pro-social factors, like what kind of an impact is your work having on people outside the organization? And, I think the assumption often in the spaces, at least that I research, is like everyone's motivated by altruism, right? Like everyone is doing this job because they want to help other people and they're willing to like take hits on all these other values as a result. And, what I found was like, that's just not true. First of all, like objectively, even if we run like standard regressions on it, pro-social motivations actually come in like third or fourth place after a lot of
Wow.
these intrinsic and extrinsic factors.
And this is
But I
within
think,
like people in nonprofit sectors or people doing government work or people doing kind of public sector, kind of third sector work.
yeah,
Huh.
I mean, that's what I found from
Yeah, yeah,
my
yeah.
research, right? So like what I found was that sort of interesting work, right? This axis of self-actualization was actually more strongly associated with job satisfaction than
Huh.
pro-social work, like the ability to help other people. But I think what's the most interesting to me is just the variation within employees, right? And so in terms of what people seek when they seek, even if they're seeking meaningful work, right? Like what will make up my preferences for meaningful work at time X is going to be different than what it's going to be at time Y, right? Because we are dynamic as human beings. I know certainly for myself, like as I was saying in the beginning, like self-transcendence has been pretty consistent, but also like the strength and the interest in the makeup at different stages of my life, as other things have been going on for me in my personal life, like that makeup shifts. And so I think really what I'm really interested in is trying to help move managers and organizations into a space where the idea is to like check in with employees and see like what is it that you are currently motivated by, but then also to keep it a dynamic process, right? Because if we want to retain employees over time, it involves embracing like what somebody was interested in 5 years ago when they were hired might not be what they're interested in now. And if we want to retain engaged employees who continue to find their work meaningful, then we need to be flexible and creative about how we can help their jobs adapt to what their current value or preference profile is.
Hmm. So you talked a little bit about, intrinsic factors, extrinsic factors, social factors, pro-social factors. It makes me think a little bit of Mario Lipswiersma's map of meaning in terms of her kind of like self-oriented, other-oriented being versus doing, kind of different factors of people doing meaningful work. But what happens when there is a good fit? What happens when there's not a good fit? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a whole literature on job fit. And, what we know is that when people feel like their preferences are being fulfilled by their jobs, they're generally more engaged, they're generally more satisfied. You know, they feel like a sense of belonging at work. And I think on the other side, right, if there's mismatch, it can start with just like a little bit of disengagement or a little bit of dissatisfaction. But what we know from Maslow and Leiter's work, I mean, over 2 decades ago, is that it can also lead to burnout, right? So that if somebody, they sort of identified these 6 different factors that lead to burnout. But what they found even more was that it was about matching on those, right? Which I certainly see in my students. I'm teaching a class on burnout right now. We were just having a discussion the other night about these 6 factors, actually. And, they were identifying like, actually like the values factor, that one's not that important to me. Or like, for somebody else, it was like, oh, the fairness factor, like that one doesn't really bother me that much, right? So I can have mismatch on that, but it doesn't really matter because actually my preference or the value that I hold for that attribute is pretty low, right?
Mhm.
And so that's where, again, like the one size fits all, like, oh, strategy is dangerous. The one thing I did find in my research that is consistent and like irrespective of people's preferences is job security.
Mm.
So it turns out people aren't great predictors of how much job security will impact their well-being. And so being able to offer job security to your employees, regardless of what they say, it turns out can be really helpful.
Can you expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I just, in terms of their preferences, I think that the challenge that happens is sometimes I guess we're not great at understanding what it is that makes us happy, right?
Mm.
But in one of the studies, most of the people were from North America. In the other one, though, it was a completely international sample of government workers from all over the world. And, I think sometimes in the United States in particular, like we accept that we might not have job security, whereas I think in other places, right, there's more of an expectation that the state is going to provide a certain level of well-being for us in terms of meeting our basic needs. So we might not think that we need job security, but it turns out actually having, to what extent are we pushing all of the social support networks onto organizations and employment when we've seen, again, cross-nationally, right, that there are places that do much better in terms of well-being indices where a lot of those features are being provided by the state as just like a baseline for
Mhm.
all human beings living in that area. And so, yeah, I think that that's probably what's going on with job security, whereas a lot of the other ones, a lot of the other preferences really are preferences that are like, do you like working with other people, right? So that's, I think the relational item is phrased something like that. And that turns out people have like really different preferences on that. Some people really like working by themselves. And if they're forced to work with other people when they want to work by themselves, then they're unhappy. And other people really want to work with other people. And if they have to do their work by themselves, then that also makes them unhappy. And so really taking those preferences into account for all the other indices really matters. And it's generally good to provide job security.
Yeah. I mean, it makes me think about different people who we've had on this podcast, like David Bluestein, for example, who's spent a lot of time thinking about the relationship between decency and meaning in our work. And and also, I mean, it goes back to the start of this conversation where you were talking about self-transcendence and self-actualization, the idea of, those kinds of different security needs versus growth needs that someone like Maslow might had. One of the guests on this podcast has been Scott Barry Kaufman, and in his reading of Maslow, he kind of talks about the fact that it's probably much more appropriate to the way that Maslow would have thought about these needs to think about it like a boat, where
Hmm.
something like security or decency is the hull of the boat. It's the thing that you're actually sitting in on the water. It's the thing that keeps you afloat. And the meaning needs and the growth needs and the relational needs and the esteem needs are more like sails that are on that boat. And if you don't have a hull, those sails aren't going to take you very far. Or if it's really windy day, you might want to actually roll those sails up. But regardless, you need to actually be sitting in the water on something. Like and if that goes away, those sails can drown you. And it's just an interesting revelation that I think that too few of us, specifically in fields like positive psychology, think about, where we're so gunning for the meaning, we're so gunning for the prosociality, or all the good stuff that is associated with well-being, that we sometimes overlook the fact that if we don't have the base, if we don't have the support, what others have called the hygiene factors at work, it's really disruptive to everything.
I completely agree with you. And, I think this has been my longstanding challenge with HR management in the nonprofit sector, which is that, I think the nonprofit sector has professionalized over the last 25 years. Like I teach students who are like committing themselves to advanced degrees, to a career length commitment to the nonprofit sector. And still, I think the assumption is like, oh, employees will just burn out and we'll just get like a new crop, right? It's like the old volunteer model, which was like, oh, we have someone who's like volunteering 10 hours a week, they'll stay until they burn out, and then we'll get like a new volunteer for 10 hours
Mm.
a week. And so the nonprofit sector feels like perpetually like a, this sailboat that's just like, I don't know, everyone's just like got their eyes
It's like
closed or
sinking.
something.
It's just
Yeah,
sinking.
exactly. It's just sinking, right? And and that's
Bailing. People are
that's a
just like
problem.
bailing water out. It's like we gotta try, yeah. So we've talked about security and how important security is. We've talked about these other kinds of needs that we have, like intrinsic needs, extrinsic needs, social needs, pro-social needs. I'd love to get into the social or relational space a little bit more. Relational is probably a better word than social. And this is where I encountered your work for the first time, and specifically talking about the idea of dark sides of meaningful
Mhm.
work. You talked a lot about, you wrote this wonderful paper probably 6, 7 years ago now around boundary inhibition that really struck a chord with me. And so I'd love to just unpack some of that work. I think that the original research group was international aid workers. Is that right? That you were working
It's
with?
true. Yeah.
Tell us about boundary inhibition.
Yeah. Thanks. Basically, I think what I've found, so yes, I've studied actually the same cohort of international aid workers for over a decade now. I love longitudinal work because I think we're dynamic as human beings. So I love seeing how people change over different stages of their lives. And so there's 270 people in the full study, and then there's a subset of about 90 that I've been interviewing, but the larger group I've been surveying every year. So that's sort of the context for this study. And what I've found in general is that people who are seeking meaningful work, oh, I'm sorry, let me just backtrack a little. People who are not seeking meaningful work, right, who just want a job that pays the bills, I find often erect quite healthy boundaries around their work, right? In order to nurture other personal interests and relationships in their non work time. I had a student once who said, like, if working in a factory packing boxes would have like actually provided enough income for me to sustain my life, like I would have kept doing that job for the rest of my life because
Right.
once I leave and I go home, I never think about work. Nobody like emails me about things that I need to do. I was never tempted to like go in on the weekends. Like when I was off, I was like truly off.
This is I live to work versus I work to live kind of
Right.
mentality. Great.
What I found, though, is for people who are in that kind of work, often their work is also precarious and greedy, right? So their employers may force them into overwork. They may have erratic schedules, right? Those are the things that are going to be boundary crossing for them. Like those are going to be the violations to their boundaries around their work time. It's generally coming from the employers and is like imposed on them against their will. But in contrast, sort of what I find is that people who find their work deeply meaningful is that that boundary around their work time is inhibited not by their employers, actually, but by themselves. And I sort of borrow from some of Mary Blair Loy's work and call these people work devoted, right? They are really devoting themselves physically, emotionally, mentally to their workplaces because they find so much meaning in it. And so then they often choose to spend significant time and energy at work, often far beyond what their employer asks of them. And there's complicating factors around sort of cultural expectations within the workplace. But I think what I found most fascinating was people really struggled to come up with like, well, what else am I going to, like so much of my identity and my meaning and my purpose and my value comes from work. And so it was just this very codependent relationship, right? In many ways. And so that's where I came up with that idea of boundary inhibition. Like they do this work because it aligns with their values. It often affirms their identities. It provides a significant degree of purpose and meaning in their lives. Yeah, that was where the sort of concept of boundary inhibition came from. And then what that paper also detailed, I don't know if you want me to chat about this, but
Yeah,
was sort of
go for it.
the conflict that led to in their lives because of having that boundary inhibition. And what I found that is it really led to this sort of multi-layered conflict, particularly in their relationships with other people in their lives, both significant others, but also family members, friends. And, it's called like the work family literature. I think increasingly they're calling themselves the work life literature. I call it work non-work because our work is part of our lives. But, often that literature looks at time-based conflict, right? Which was one of the three facets that I found, which is basically people's self-propelled willingness to engage in overwork leads to this time-based conflict. And basically, you have less time in your non-work life for relationships and activities because of all of the time that you're spending at work. So that can be difficult for people. If we're good friends and I can never get together with you because I'm spending all my time at work, like there's probably going to be some conflict in the relationship about that, and the relationship may not make it through. The second layer that I find is about trust. And this relates less to the time that people spend when they find their work meaningful and more to like the devotion part. Like if work calls you at 3:00 on a Saturday and you're at your kid's soccer game, are you going to be like, no, I'm at my kid's soccer game. I'm going to like be there with my family, or are you going to like drop everything and go run off and be with work? Like, where is your devotion lie? And so it's hard for people who are in relationships with these people in deeply meaningful work if it's hard for them to trust them, really, because they end up canceling plans a lot last minute. They're just not reliable if they are always going to turn to sort of an erratic work schedule. And so that's difficult. And then the third layer that I find is about the connection in the relationship, the emotional connection. And this is the part where I saw some really interesting variation, actually, which is that people who were in relationships actually with other people who were devoted to work, they excused that time-based conflict and trust-based conflict because they were like, oh, I get it. Like, I also feel like that about my work. I also feel like my identity is wrapped up in my work. Like, I get why you left the soccer game. Like, I fully support you in doing that because I'm going to do it tomorrow. Right. And so that sort of connection that they are able to form around, I call it occupational value homophily, basically the idea that they both equally value doing meaningful work attenuates the challenge from the other two. And then the relationships that had more challenge were if you were in a relationship, again, this is like not just a significant other, but any other relationship where the other person was more of those like work to live kind of folks, then that can really lead to a lot of emotional disconnection in the relationship because the person's like, why do you keep prioritizing your work over me?
Mm,
And, if I have a work to live relationship with my work and you have a live to work relationship with your work, then I'm going to start resenting you really for continuing to prioritize work because I don't really get why it's so important to you to keep
mm.
prioritizing your work. So,
Everyone that I have told this research nugget to who works in spaces that where there's a lot of meaningfulness, where people are really devoted, where people are doing quote unquote good work, have resonated so much with this insight. And it's just one of those things that's almost obvious as soon as you say it, but is not something that most people think about. And I find it so critical because some of these dark sides of meaning, which I think, as you very aptly describe, are things that we do to ourselves, even more so than things that other people might do to us, that the protective factors that we have are often our relationships. I mean, the ways in which we protect our well-being, the ways in which we can emerge from some of the ways that Maslow has described burnout, the ways that we can ultimately thrive in the context of challenge. So much of that is about our social connection with other people. And the fact that the meaningful work disconnect, that value disconnect, like a devotion disconnect, what are you actually devoted to, can actually be something that rips apart relationships outside of the work context is incredibly profound. And or it can also really build the relationship. I had another guest on this podcast, Steve Leventhal, who was talking about his relationship with his wife, and we were talking about your research, and she also, they both work in international aid, and for them it's a relationship builder. I mean, it really is this opportunity to connect over something that they are both so deeply devoted to, where there's such values alignment. It's really made their relationship in so many different ways. So just understanding that nuance, I think, is really profound for people who are choosing to do work that they are devoted to and asking about what are the consequences to the other pieces of my well-being pie.
yeah, thanks for saying that. And I think that, yeah, on an individual level, it can lead to like a lot of synergy or disconnect. I would say on a more macro level, it is concerning to me, right, that we sort of subvert our relationships in favor of work. So I think there's a challenge there. I mean, I'm also married to someone that I met doing international aid. We're very value aligned. Like we've both been very passionate about having meaningful work. So like I totally get it. And on a broader level,
It shouldn't have to be a choice. It shouldn't have
yeah,
to.
I would love for us to be able to be in more balance.
Yeah. Your research in this space has certainly continued. I know that your latest paper around this is all about actually single people. So not necessarily people
Mhm.
in relationship, but I guess other people within that cohort where their devotion has really impacted their aspirations for a relationship. So tell us a little bit about that cohort.
Yeah, certainly. What I find most fascinating about this group, and this is again one of those sort of research nuggets that like emerged over time, because I really became interested in not just like how does doing this work impact our current relationships, but how does it impact what we can envision for ourselves more broadly outside of work. And where I found that impacted people, there are two different groups for whom that impacted people a lot. It was single people who wanted to be in relationships, but they were so devoted to work, it was hard really to find the time in the space to navigate that path. And then people who wanted children. And again, that path to parenthood is not always straightforward. It seldom is for most people, right? And like, how do I create the time and the space in my life to make that, to walk that path? So in this paper, I focused on single people who wanted to be, well, I focused on all single people, a subset of whom did not want to be in relationships, were very happy being single. And then a larger subset that did want to be in relationships, but were struggling to do that while working in international aid and humanitarian relief work, which, just for listeners who aren't familiar with that context, is like a very extreme context of meaningful work because often you are getting placed in different countries. You're moving around to different places. Often when you're in those countries, you're in rural areas. There's just a lot of barriers within the context of doing that work in the way that most people find most meaningful to being around a diverse array of other people for whom you might want to find a partner. Often what people do in that work is they find another aid worker. But then the challenge is keeping those relationships together because one person might get posted to Afghanistan, another person gets posted someplace different. And then are you going to sacrifice your career? So anyways, there's challenges is what I guess I'm trying to just lay
Mm-hmm.
out. And what I found most fascinating in the longitudinal data was that I would have these conversations with people and they would say like, yeah, I'm loving my work. It's so meaningful. I'm working these like 14-hour days in the field. It's like my dream job. It's everything I ever wanted to do. I'm in my late 20s. I'm in my early 30s. I'm lonely. Like that's the part of my life that feels not fulfilled. And so I would really love to figure out how in this next year to like find a relationship. And then I'd talk to them a year later and it would be like the same story. And then I'd talk to them 6 years later and it was still like the same story. And so I just became really curious, like people deeply want this. Like there were like tears in most of these conversations, but then they weren't changing their work life to actually make space for it. And so I just got really curious, like, why is this happening for folks in this particular way, right? And what I found was that there was just a lot of fear for people about proactively cutting back on work in order to find someone to nurture a relationship with.
Mm.
Because when they were posted in these remote locations, like it was clearly not working that they were finding a partner, right? And so to find a partner, like the scale back at work would require like taking a job in headquarters. So like moving back to DC, which is totally possible within international aid work, but it's definitely not the most meaningful. It's not why people entered into aid work,
Right,
is to like
right, of
be based
course.
in a cubicle in Washington, DC,
Mm.
writing reports or something. And so what I found was that people desperately wanted this different personal life, but they just kept like postponing it for the future, right? And what I realized was that their work wasn't just simply meaningful, it was like their core identity, right? Like these people saw themselves as aid workers. Like if you think of an identity map, it was like at the center of their identity map, being an aid worker, right? Moreover, this is an identity that's like both greedy and fragile, right? Like, do I feel like an aid worker if I'm sitting in a cubicle in DC? Most people didn't, right? And so then that felt like a threat to that core identity to take that job transition. And for most of them, this kind of like this thought process, which I saw them doing every single year as they were like weighing, like, do I move back to DC and hope I'll find someone? Or do I like stay in the field and hope I'll find someone? And for many of them, it sort of sparked, I call it an existential crisis in the paper because it
Mm.
really was this like fear of losing their identity were they to scale back on work. And so I developed this metaphor in the paper of like they use their devotion to work almost as this form of like identity armor, right? Because
Mm.
they're so afraid of losing this sense of self and they don't have an alternative to fall back on, right? So the sort of comparison group is people who had some sort of external exogenous situation. So their mother got sick or they ended up having to do some sort of concrete caregiving that required them to relocate and change work. They made that transition so much more easily
Mm.
because they could say like, oh, I'm no longer an aid worker, but now I'm like caretaking for my mother, right? Like that's clearly something that's going to provide a different kind of meaning, but it still provides meaning. It's still a clear identity. Whereas for these single folks without any sort of relationship prospects, it was like, I am removing the aid worker identity from my identity network and I have nothing to turn towards. Right? Which was really this existential crisis. So actually, over the 8 years in the study, I did not see a single person who was single who made a decision to scale back at work. Everybody who made that decision had some sort of a nascent relationship where it was like, oh, well, I'm going to scale back at work. I'm going to like go move to the city where my partner is for a year. And then if that doesn't work out, I'll like jump back and do this again. But they had like something concrete to jump into,
Mhm.
right? Which made that uncertainty, I think, less threatening for folks.
I found it interesting in the paper that in the research to us LGBTQ plus individuals found this even more so as a thing. And it just made me think about multiple identities or intersectional identities that we might have. And I mean, do you have any thoughts about kind of why that seemed even more of a thing for the queer community that you were looking at?
Yeah, thanks so much for bringing that up. I appreciate it. Yeah, this sort of stark trade-off that people faced, it was definitely not viewed uniformly across all social identities. And it was both straight women and queer people accurately really perceived that there was more of a stark trade-off between the work that they loved and a more fulfilling personal life, right? Straight men had an easier time finding a partner who was local to the area where they were, who was content not having meaningful work. And so that became easier. It was much more difficult for straight women to find a man in the local environment who was willing to have her be the primary breadwinner and or to take like a backseat to her career, or even another aid worker, to be totally frank, that would be willing to take that. And then for queer folks, it was actually like even more difficult because a lot of these environments that people are working in, it's like physically unsafe for people to be out, let alone like living with their partners. And so, yeah, I mean, that not only impeded like having a relationship, but for some of the folks in my sample, like just their own queer identity development, right? Really felt like it was hard to do that in these places where folks lived. And it was often an exogenous shock that then like forced someone back to a headquarters location, and then they were able to like develop that aspect of their lives more. But it was really difficult. I mean, women on average made their alterations also like 15 years younger than men, which has all kinds of long-term career consequences we know in terms of like salary and stuff. And actually, out of my study population of 270 people, women were 5 times more likely to be single than men, five
Wow.
times more likely. And it was really uncommon for queer folks to be partnered and doing this work. Right. And so it was a really real trade off for people who held these identities to have to choose between like, do I want to do this work that's deeply meaningful for me? Or do I want to develop my personal life and have like an intimate relationship that offers emotional support and all of those things that we know that personal relationships can offer for us. And so I think it is a really important way to understand the ways in which intersectional inequalities end up affecting people. And also the emotional experience of decision making was far more stressful for these people because they perceived these inequalities, right? And so like each time they had to make a decision about a new job, it was like gut wrenching for them because they really felt like they were choosing between like, I want this in my personal life and I want this at work. And like, how do I make these decisions? So yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think it is a really important part of the study.
I want to ask you in the context of this whole entire broad frame, which is around, values alignment. How does my identity, my values, the things that I think that are important to me fit into the actual job and context I have, and what are the implications, and all sorts of things that have nothing to do with my job but have everything to do with my life, right? Like that's my bottom line of this conversation so far. What recommendations do you have? I mean, if especially, if there is a nonprofit leader, an international aid development leader who's listening to this podcast, what would you say to them around how to think about these alignment questions in the way in which they are designing jobs?
Yeah, I mean, these are conversations I've had actually with a lot of leaders across international NGOs in the aid space. And I do think that those organizations are making changes, right? I mean, I think that they are trying to the extent that they can, like provide, like in the way that academia does, I think more of now, like providing spousal hires, right? So ensuring that people who are already together can stay together. I think, I think that a small dose of flexibility goes a long way in terms of, yeah, thinking through how you allow people to job craft. I also think that, I mean, I said earlier that, boundary inhibition is when people are like willing to go above and beyond what their workplaces ask of them. You know, I do say that, like, this is definitely an area where organizations are not immune. Like, organizations are, from where I sit, are often, almost always actually, yeah, very happy to take as much as people are willing to give. And I think that's particularly true in nonprofit and NGO work because it's almost always underfunded for the scope of the social problem or environmental problems that the organizations are trying to tackle. So, like, if someone's willing to work 14-hour days, 7 days a week, like, there are very few organizations that are going to be like, no, actually, like, let's figure out a more sustainable solution here. And so I think that's often what my conversations are with organizations is just some of those, I think, fairly standard best practices around work boundaries that, you know, where leaders need to model a lot of these things also that they're encouraging employees to do in terms of, when are you sending emails? How urgent are you making things? Do they need to be that urgent? Do we need to ask people to like cancel going to their cousin's wedding because we have to send them last minute to this place? Or like, can we rethink? And I think there is this sense of urgency in aid. And sometimes, it is legitimate because there are people's lives who are literally on the line and like waiting for humanitarian relief. And I think it can foster this sort of martyr complex, which isn't really healthy for anyone. And, I think in some ways, I think this kind of leads in some ways, a new project that I've been working on where, when you're doing this kind of work, where you're really like up against huge structural and institutional challenges, being realistic about what can actually get done and being able to have organizational conversations about like, okay, if we actually have this much bandwidth, like how are we going to prioritize that rather than trying to get like X+3, because that extra 3 is going to end up like all of your employees are going to burn out, right? And you still haven't like solved the problem. Like we still haven't solved global hunger or like we still haven't solved the climate crisis just because our employees are working 14-hour days rather than 8-hour days. But I think it's hard. I think that mindset can be hard, particularly for people who are super committed to the work.
It makes me think a lot about Vivek Murthy's workplace well-being model. And one of the things that I really like about the way that they've positioned work-life, well, they call it work-life harmony as opposed to work-life balance. And I think that just, again, it speaks to this whole entire conversation and that one size fits none. What is harmony for one is not going to be harmony for another, and never is harmony actually balance. Like 50-50 is not something that as a musician you'd necessarily like everyone's exactly equal all the time is unlikely to produce a very good harmony. So understanding, taking the work to understand what individuals need and how you can adjust and create autonomy and flexibility within the space to give choice, to give voice. All of those things are so critically important. And thinking it outside of the box. I mean, the kind of spousal hiring is a really probably brilliant innovation that very, very few people in this space actually think through in that way, and could probably go a long way in terms of having 2 incredibly devoted people on your payroll. Here, this is absolutely going to be a 2-parter. And so the next conversation that we're going to have is going to be a conversation about the myth of agency. What would be the 15-second teaser that you would give to people listening to this conversation now about why they should tune in to the next episode where we talk about the myth of agency?
So the myth of agency basically is the false cultural idea that an individual can fully overcome both structural and institutional barriers through strategic individual behaviors. And what I find is that both formal training and informal socialization prepare a lot of people engaged in meaningful work, and particularly frontline staff, to adopt this myth, either with respect to their own agency, right? Like, I can change the world, or with respect to their clients. Like, if I give my clients these skills, they can lift themselves up out of these undesirable conditions that they're in. And what I find is that basically, this often leads to burnout. So I'm very curious about a subset of workers that I found that seem to avoid this by avoiding this myth of agency. And it leads, I think, to these really radical outcomes, both for themselves and their clients.
Amazing. Well, for those who are listening, tune in. There'll be a part 2. Thank you so much, Carrie.
Thank you so much, Andrew. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Meaningful Work Matters. If you haven't already done so, be sure to subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform. And if this episode resonated with you, please take a moment to leave us a review. Your feedback helps us make this podcast better and reach more listeners. You can connect with me, Andrew Soren, on LinkedIn, or visit www.eubd.ca to learn more about Eudaimonic by Design. Finally, if what you heard today spoke to you, tell your colleagues and people in your community about our podcast. We really appreciate your support in making meaningful work matter. See you next time.